Welcome to Tuesday Tune-Up. I am the Reverend Peter Steinbrenner, and this is a continuation of our discussion of the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, the book that in many ways defines who we are as Episcopalians. During the past few weeks, we have been discussing the history of the Episcopal Church, but today we're going to review the Book of Common Prayer itself. So, now is a good time to go get a prayer book, if you have one, and I'll just wait right here for a moment. So welcome back. I have with me 3 different prayer books I can just show you. This is one that I received when I was confirmed. It's the 1928 prayer book. It's the one we used from 1928 until 1979, so it's used for almost 50 years. And probably many of you grew up with this prayer book. My probably strongest memory of the prayer book is that the services took extraordinarily a long time. I was typically an adolescent, a teenager, and we'd sit down in a pew, and the priest would just start praying and making comments and speaking and doing the sermons. It was all about the priest at that time. I found myself just saying, come on, can't we just get to the Holy Communion so I can get my wine and my bread and I can leave? And that was probably from a perspective of a teenager. It truly is a very meditative service. It's, I think people even today, if they were to go through it and use that service, they'd find it a very powerful service, but it uses an older language, lots of these and thous, and the sentences tend to run on for a while, and we no longer use this book in the Episcopal Church. In 1979, we came up with a new edition of the Book of Common Prayer, and this is the one we still use today. That's now been about 44 years that we've been using this Book of Common Prayer. And you see right here, this is about how big it is. We have hardback volumes in our church. Many of you may not have used a prayer book at Epiphany since you've been here, since we tend to put the whole service in a bulletin. I also have a book that I use a lot, and it's got a prayer book in it. So you can see here's the prayer book, but it also has the hymns. So I can use this book for both my hymnal and the prayer book. The problem with the book is it is quite heavy, and the paper really is thin. So it's somewhat difficult to use, but I've been using it for about 20 years. So these prayer books contain all we need for nearly any kind of service, from morning prayer to Eucharist to baptism to marriage, and even for funerals. And the best way to get started to see what's in the prayer book is to open your book up to page 5. And on page 5, you will find a table of contents. And that table of contents, if it starts, you can see in it real quickly that there's the daily offices, there's the collects, there's actually a calendar in here, and there's a list of special days, and then there's a section on the Holy Eucharist. There's a lot of information, and you can, if you go through that table of contents, you get a really good idea what's in this prayer book. So next, I would have you turn to page 15. Now, page 15, and it's taken me a while to get there, is the calendar of the church year. It starts off and it lists the 7 principal feasts: Easter Day, Ascension Day, the Day of Pentecost, Trinity Sunday, All Saints Day, Christmas Day, and the Epiphany. The next page talks about Sundays. And if you look at that, you see that Sundays are always feast days. And so there's special rules around Sundays. There's also a list of other holy days and days of special occasions. And then when you get to page 19, you can't see this is backwards in your video, But if you turn to page 19, you'll see an actual calendar with a list of all the holy days, all the lesser feasts, and you'll see a lot of names. Maybe some of them you know. There's a good chance that most of these you don't know. On the first page, on January 28th, we can see there's a lesser feast recognizing Thomas Aquinas. Most of us know him. But a good chance that maybe most of us don't know Abbot Antony from Egypt. And we can just go on. Gregory the Great, another person we probably heard of. But probably Bishop Cuthbert, we haven't heard of. Anyway, so there's all the calendar for every month is in that section. Now finally, if you go to page 37, starting on that, you're going to find this is where our daily offices begin. So by daily offices, I'm talking about morning prayer, evening prayer, Compline. And you'll notice also that for almost every office, there is either a rite one, which is traditional, uses traditional language. You'll see these, thous, thines in there, and language very similar to the 1928 prayer book. You'll also see there's rite two, and we consider rite two as contemporary language, even though it's 44 years old already. Epiphany typically uses rite one at 8 o'clock service on the first Sunday of each month. For all other Sunday services, we use rite two. On page 37, you see rite one for morning prayer. On page 61, you'll see evening prayer. And this is a prayer that can be done typically around 5 or 6 o'clock. And you go beyond, you're going to find there's also, when you get to page 75, you're going to find morning prayer, and it's rite two. It again is in the contemporary language. There's also a noonday prayer on page 103, an evening prayer for rite two on page 115, and then Compline. Compline is one of my very favorite services, usually done late in the evening. You'll often see this done during retreats, and sometimes Compline, some churches will do Compline during the evenings during Lent. So Compline, if you get a chance, it's just a very beautiful. We have used it 3 or 4 times during Sunday Joy for to close out or begin that evening. Now, let's say you're by yourself and you say, is there something I can do just every day? During Lent, I want to do a special discipline where I do some kind of a worship every day. Well, if you go and you look on page 136, you're going to find a list of actually one-page devotions, daily services for individuals and families. And this is a good discipline, especially for Lent. But I've talked to other people that have done this almost their whole life. In fact, I can remember our new Bishop Elizabeth talking about how she used to always go through the daily devotions when she was a younger person. But you see there's a devotion for morning. There's a devotion for noontime, and it's about 1 page long. There's a devotion for early evening, and again, it's about 1 page long. We can move on, and you'll find something that we see seldom in our church, but it is something that is used during Epiphany, and it's called the Great Litany. And you'll probably, we have something very similar to that we're using right now, just in a different form. But the Great Litany starts on page 148. And then we move to what are called the collects of the year. So the prayers, the special collects we have, the priest just doesn't make those up. They're actually in the prayer book, and there's a lot of them. It begins on page 159, and there's a series of traditional collects for like the first day of Advent, the second day of Advent, for Christmas Day, for Epiphany, for all the different seasons of the years, even going through, hey, we're going to be going through Easter week, through Holy Week right now. And you'll see that there's a lot of collects for each of the days during Holy Week. And then for the Sundays afterwards. And there's a list of traditional collects. There's a list of contemporary collects. And those collects go from page 159 all the way to almost page 300, all the way to page 298. But on page 299 begins the first of what I call our typical worship services. And this is one that's done 4 or 5 times a year at Epiphany when we have people that want to be baptized. It is a holy baptism. So whenever we do the baptism, that starts on page 299 of the Book of Common Prayer. And you can look through that and you can see, oh yeah, this is what we do. Eventually, holy baptism moves on to Eucharist. And if we were doing Rite 1, that means that it would move on to page 315. I would say that probably very rarely happens at Epiphany. So typically, it would move on to Rite 2. Now I'm going to talk about Holy Eucharist Rite 1. There are 2 forms we can use for the Eucharistic prayer. The Eucharistic prayer is really what we would consider the Holy Communion during the service. And you can either use, I think it's called Form 1 or Form 2. Eucharistic Prayer 1, Eucharistic Prayer 2. So, in the past, in the 1928 prayer book, we only had 1 form we can use. Now for traditional services, we have 2 forms that we can use. We turn on to page 355, and this is the most used portion of any prayer book. You'll find I have a few torn pages in mine. I've noticed this prayer book that I borrowed from Rick here. The pages are really wrinkled and kind of creased here. So you can tell this is the one that's used all the time. It's the one that we're the most familiar with. And this is Holy Eucharist Rite 2. But even in Holy Eucharist Rite 2, there are several options for the Eucharistic prayer. We have Eucharistic Prayer A, Eucharistic Prayer B, Eucharistic Prayer C, and Eucharistic Prayer D. You'll see they're all listed here. So we have options. And we use those Eucharistic prayers throughout the year. And so you probably, if you look through those, you'll recognize almost all those Eucharistic prayers. Now when Father Rick gets done doing announcements during the service, you notice he typically concludes with saying something like, "Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us an offering and sacrifice to God." Now, Rick doesn't make that up. Those are called offertory sentences, and those are listed on page 376. On page 383 begins our intercessory prayers. These are where we can find the prayers of people. Now, we typically take a little bit of license because we're allowed to change what those intercessions are. And we don't typically use Form 1, Form 2, Form 3 at Epiphany, but many churches do. And so if you look through the prayers of the people beginning on page 383, you'll find there's several forms we can use. Some are long, some are quite short. Form 6 is one of the ones that's very commonly used in churches, and that's found on page 392. But wait, at Epiphany right now during Lent, we're using a service that's not in the prayer book. It's very different. Well, it's not really very different, but there are different words, and it's much more modern. And where that comes from is during General Convention, they realized, the prayer book needs to have some way to change it more often so we get some more different flexibilities. And so they created a booklet. It's called Enriching Our Worship. And the Eucharist and the service that we're using during Lent comes from enriching our worship. It's a book that you can purchase, or you can just go online and just type in Enriching Our Worship, and you can find it. There's several different booklets that have that title, all do with more modern modifications to our prayer book. So that brings us all the way to page 400, which is just about halfway through the prayer book. So I think this is a good place to stop. Next week, we will review the remainder of the book, and this will include the Psalms. It'll include services for marriage and for funerals. It'll include many of the historical documents that form the theology of the Episcopal Church. They're all in here. And also, I will discuss a strange word that some of you might have heard, many of you probably not. I'm going to discuss the word rubrics and the importance of rubrics for our services. So, until next week, goodbye, and I hope that you have a wonderful week.